It happened in the dark, which is the cruelest way for a flood to come. In the mountain valleys along the border between Nepal and Tibet, people were asleep in villages that had stood on the banks of the river for generations when a wall of water came down out of the high mountains without warning in the middle of the night and swept entire settlements into the river as though they had never existed. By the time the sun rose, whole villages were simply gone, the houses and the people in them carried away by a torrent that had appeared from nowhere, a bridge connecting two countries torn from its foundations and vanished, roads erased, and along the swollen brown river, a desperate search beginning for the dozens confirmed dead and the many more still missing. This is one of the most terrifying kinds of disaster on Earth, a flood that comes not from days of rain that might have offered some warning, but suddenly, violently, out of the mountains themselves, in the dark. And the water that did this did not even begin in the country it destroyed. It came from across the border, from the high glaciers and hidden lakes of Tibet, released in an instant to come roaring down into Nepal. Before we go further, a quick word, because a lot of people watch these all the way through and forget to subscribe. If you want to understand disasters like this and the science behind why they are happening more often, hit subscribe. It is free, it takes a second, and it makes sure the next one reaches you. So subscribe, stay with me, and now let us begin. To understand the horror, you have to picture the place. The border between Nepal and Tibet runs through some of the highest and most rugged terrain on the planet. A landscape of towering peaks and deep narrow valleys carved by rivers tumbling down from the glaciers, wherever the land flattens even a little near the water. People have built their lives, villages clinging to narrow strips of habitable ground, towns grown up around the crossing points between the two countries. But a river in a steep mountain valley is a far more dangerous thing than a river on a plain, because when a sudden surge comes down such a valley, there is nowhere for it to spread out. The narrow walls channel and concentrate the flood, turning it into a fast, deep, violent wall of water that fills the valley floor from side to side, and anything on that floor, the villages, the roads, the bridges, the people, is directly in its path with nowhere to run but up the steep walls, in the dark, with only seconds of warning if any comes at all. And that is exactly what happened, a sudden surge coming down one of these narrow border valleys in the night. The flood struck with a force that left almost nothing behind, sweeping away homes, carrying off vehicles, destroying the infrastructure that connected the region to the world. A major bridge linking Nepal and China across the river was torn away entirely, severing a vital connection and cutting off the very route rescuers would need. Container yards full of goods waiting to cross the border were swept into the river along with trucks and equipment. Hydropower facilities were damaged or destroyed, and most devastating of all, people. Dozens confirmed dead and hundreds reported missing, including not only local residents, but workers and traders and travelers from other countries who happened to be at the crossing when the water came, all caught in the path of a flood that arrived faster than anyone could react. Here is where you can help me, and it takes only a second. If you are from Nepal, or anywhere in the Himalayan region, or you have family in these mountains, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read them, and it helps me understand who this story is reaching, and it lets others following this know they are not alone in caring. It costs nothing, and it means more than you think. So where did the water come from, if not from days of rain? The answer is one of the most important and least understood dangers in all the mountains of the world. The water came from above, from the high glaciers and hidden lakes among the peaks, and specifically from the sudden release of one of those lakes, a phenomenon known as a glacial lake outburst flood. As the glaciers melt, the meltwater collects in lakes held back by natural dams of loose rock and ice and debris, the rubble left behind by the glaciers themselves. These lakes can grow large, holding enormous quantities of water high above the valleys where people live, held in place only by these fragile dams. And these dams can fail. When one gives way, whether overtopped or struck by a falling piece of ice or rock that sends a wave over it, or simply weakened until it collapses, the entire lake can empty in minutes, releasing all of its stored water at once in a sudden catastrophic flood that rushes down the valley with terrible speed and force. That, by the assessment of those studying the disaster, is what came down into these border villages in the night, a lake in the high mountains bursting its natural dam and sending its water crashing down. If this is helping you understand what really happened, do me two quick favors that keep a channel like this going. Tap the like button so more people who want to understand these disasters can find this. And more importantly, share this with someone in your family who follows the region or cares about this kind of story. Because getting the real picture out matters, especially for an event the wider world will forget within days. A like and a share with your family, and then we keep going. A glacial lake outburst flood is so uniquely deadly because of the combination of its speed, its power, and its lack of warning. Unlike a flood from rainfall, which builds over hours or days and gives some time to see it coming, this kind happens almost instantly. One moment the lake sits quietly high in the mountains, and the next its dam has failed, and its entire volume is racing down the valley, so that for the people below there is no gradual rise, only a sudden roar, and then the flood itself. And it does not come down as clear water. As it descends the steep valley, it picks up enormous quantities of rock and boulders and mud, becoming a dense, churning slurry of water and stone with the power to smash buildings, tear away bridges, and reshape the valley itself. And because it originates high and remote, often unmonitored places, and happens so suddenly, there is frequently no warning at all, no siren, no alert, no time to flee, especially at night when people are asleep and cannot even see the water coming. Now we come to the question that makes this not just a tragedy, but a warning, which is why these floods are happening, and happening more often. The answer lies in the warming climate and the particular vulnerability of the high mountains to it. The Great Ranges of Asia hold the largest store of ice outside the polar regions, so much that the region is called the Third Pole, and that ice is melting faster than almost anyone anticipated, with the warming amplified in these heights. As the glaciers melt, two things happen that increase the danger. First, the melting produces more water, which collects in more and larger lakes, so the number and size of these dangerous lakes keeps growing. Second, the warming destabilizes the mountains themselves, thawing the frozen ground that once held slopes and dams together, making the rockfalls and collapses that trigger outbursts more likely. So the warming is loading the mountains with more and larger lakes, while making the failures that release them more likely, a double increase in the danger. And this flood is a direct expression of that growing threat. And I know, this is the second time I am asking, so I will keep it quick. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about getting these events right, rather than just reacting to a headline, and that is exactly who I make these for. Subscribing keeps them coming. That is all. Now, back to it. There is a cruel dimension to this disaster that complicates everything, which is that the flood crossed an international border. The lake that burst was in Tibet, in Chinese territory, and the villages it destroyed were in Nepal, Downstream, the danger originated in one country, and the devastation fell on another. The lakes that threaten Nepal's border valleys sit in territory where Nepal cannot monitor them, cannot assess their danger, cannot act to reduce the risk. Any warning system would need to span the border and share information across a political boundary, and such cross-border cooperation on hazard monitoring is difficult. So the people of these valleys live beneath a threat they cannot see, held in a neighboring country, released without warning to come down upon them. The water does not respect the border, but the systems for managing the danger are divided by it, and that mismatch is part of what makes these communities so terribly exposed. In the discussion of glaciers and mechanisms, it is easy to lose sight of the people, and they must not be lost. When the flood came in the night, it came upon communities entirely unprepared, because how could they be prepared for a thing that gave no warning? Families asleep were woken, if they woke at all, by the roar of water already upon them, and many had no chance to escape. The border crossing, a place of constant activity, was struck when people were present, and among the missing are nationals of other countries who had come to this remote border for trade or travel. Security personnel were swept away, workers at the infrastructure sites were lost, and in the aftermath, the search has been agonizing. Because the very flood that took them also destroyed the roads and bridges needed to reach them, cutting off the disaster zone. Each of the missing is a person, a life, a family waiting for news, and their number, still uncertain, is the true measure of this disaster, far more than any statistic about water volumes. And this is not the first time this exact stretch of border has been struck, which is part of what makes it so alarming. The same region has been hit before by a flood carrying the same signature, water surging down from a lake bursting on the Tibet side, tearing away the same kind of infrastructure, the bridges and the trade points that connect the two countries, killing and displacing the people caught below. When a place is struck once by such a disaster, it can be called a freak event, a terrible piece of bad luck. When it is struck again by the same mechanism in the same valleys, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and it stops being an accident and starts being a trend, the visible edge of a changing climate reaching down into the same vulnerable communities again and again. The people of these border valleys are not being unlucky once. They are living in a place where the warming mountains above them keep producing the same catastrophe, where the lakes keep forming and bursting, where the danger is not a single event that is past, but a recurring threat that returns. And each new flood is another confirmation that this is the new reality of life beneath these melting peaks. This is also a warning about a much larger danger hanging over the entire Himalayan region. There are thousands of glacial lakes across the high mountains of Asia, and as the climate warms and the glaciers melt, more of them are forming and growing, and a significant number are considered potentially dangerous. And the valleys below are not empty. They are home to millions upon millions of people, communities strung along the rivers that flow down from the mountains, sitting, often unknowingly, in the potential path of an outburst flood. This border disaster is one lake among thousands bursting to destroy the communities below, but it is not unique, and it will not be the last. As the warming continues, the frequency and danger of these floods is expected to increase, threatening more and more of the vast population that lives in the shadow of the world's highest mountains. There is a deeper injustice woven through this, which is that the people who suffer most did the least to cause the warming that drives it. The communities of these valleys are not wealthy industrial societies. They are poor mountain communities, living close to the land, contributing almost nothing to the emissions warming the planet, and yet they are on the front line of the consequences. among the first and hardest hit by the melting of the ice. The people asleep in those villages had done nothing to bring the flood down upon them, and yet it came, born of a warming that others caused. The aftermath of a disaster like this is its own prolonged ordeal, long after the water has passed. The flood does not only kill in the moment it arrives. It isolates and endangers the survivors for days and weeks afterward, because it destroys the very things they need to recover. The roads are gone, so aid cannot easily reach the area, and the injured cannot easily be taken out. The bridges are gone, so communities are cut off from one another and from help. Communication lines are down, so families cannot even learn whether their loved ones survived. And the danger has not fully passed, because the same conditions that produced the flood, the unstable slopes and the swollen rivers and the threat of further outbursts, remain, so that rescuers must work in a place that is still dangerous, still capable of another surge or a landslide at any moment. In the high, remote terrain of the border, where even in normal times travel is slow and difficult, all of this is magnified. And the search for the missing stretches on painfully, hampered at every turn by the destruction the flood left behind, so that the disaster continues to unfold long after the water itself has drained away down the valley. So what can be done? There is real hope, and it deserves to be said. The dangerous lakes can be identified and monitored with satellites and field surveys. Early warning systems can be installed on the most dangerous. Sensors that detect the beginning of an outburst and sound an alarm down the valley, giving the communities below the precious minutes they need to reach high ground. Some lakes can even be made safer, their water levels lowered by engineering to reduce the pressure on their dams. Communities can be taught to recognize the danger and know where to flee. And above all, the cross-border cooperation these shared hazards demand can be built, the sharing of monitoring and warning across the boundaries the floods ignore. None of this is easy, and none of it can eliminate the danger, but all of it can reduce the toll, can turn some of these catastrophes into near misses. The technology and the knowledge exist. What is needed is the will and the resources and the cooperation to deploy them before the next lake bursts. It is worth pausing on how abstract the phrase climate change can feel until it becomes something like this. For most people, most of the time, the warming of the planet is a distant idea, a set of graphs and projections and arguments, something that will matter someday to someone somewhere. But in a border valley in the Himalaya, in the middle of the night, it stopped being abstract and became a wall of water in the dark that swallowed the sleeping. This is what the melting of the glaciers actually looks like when it reaches human lives. Not a slow retreat of ice in a paper, but a sudden, violent flood that erases a village. The abstract made concrete, arriving all at once in someone's home. And that is perhaps the most important thing to carry away, that the changing climate is not only a future threat, but a present one, already here, already killing. So let us hold both the tragedy and the warning together. It is a tragedy, a real and terrible loss of life. Entire villages swept into the river in the night, families destroyed, a stretch of border between two nations devastated in minutes, and that loss deserves to be mourned and not reduced to a mere illustration. But it is also a warning about a danger growing across the entire roof of the world, as the warming melts the great glaciers of Asia and fills the high mountains with more and larger lakes held back by more fragile dams, poised above the valleys where hundreds of millions live. This flood is what that danger looks like when it strikes, and it will strike again, unless the warnings are heeded and the systems built and the deeper cause confronted. And so, As the search continues along that swollen brown river for the ones the water took, the rest of us who watch from far away should take from this more than a passing horror. We should understand what took them and remember that the same mountains, warming still, are holding more water yet in more lakes. Above more villages, waiting for the nights to come,